Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started, and as folks sign on, they'll just get caught up. We're going to have a bit of an intro, but yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to today's SEER webinar titled Oceanographic Responses to Offshore Wind from First Principles to Potential Effects. My name is Katie Morris, and I'm an earth scientist with the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Today's webinar, we're going to start with an introduction. Unfortunately, Joy Page couldn't make it today, so we're not going to have her speak, but we'll then move on to an overview of SEER, as well as an introduction to today's topic. We're then going to hear from today's speakers, including Eileen Hoffman from Old Dominion University, Beth Scott from University of Aberdeen, and Kaus Raghukumar from Integral Consulting. Following the presentations, we will have a moderated Q&A from the with just the panelists, and then we'll have a Q&A from the audience. And people are welcome to pose questions in the chat, and we will aim to get to those during the audience portion. So funding for the SEER project in this webinar come from the U.S. Department of Energy, Wind Energy Technologies Office. And we had hoped to have Joy Page here, but unfortunately she's not able to make it, but she is the lead at DOE who oversees this project. So for folks on the call that are not familiar with SEER, which stands for the Synthesis of Environmental Effects Research, this is an effort led by the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Pacific Northwest National Lab with funding from DOE's Wind Energy Technologies Office. And the objective of SEER is to share information on the environmental effects of offshore wind energy. And the themes depicted below highlight the key areas of focus, and these include the introduction of new structures and effects on fish ecology, the presence of vessels and effects of vessel collision, electromagnetic fields, underwater noise effects, and bat and bird interactions with offshore wind energy. We also look at risks to marine life from marine debris and floating cable systems, as well as benthic disturbances from foundations, anchors, and cables. So there are a number of research products associated with SEER. These include research briefs that summarize the state of knowledge on stressor-receptor interactions, monitoring methods, and mitigation measures. There's also a webinar series of which today's session is part of, where findings are disseminated. We also produce a summary of research recommendations that highlight information gaps, barriers, and challenges. And for additional information on the SEER project, you can go to this website below or use the QR code as indicated. And for folks who are also on the call, this is going to be recorded. And so if you aren't able to pull that website up now, you'll be able to access that via the recording. So today's presentation will highlight potential oceanographic effects of offshore wind from physical processes to potential ecosystem interactions. And before we get to that, I'd like to provide some background information on oceanography, nutrient cycling, and biological productivity. So the ocean is influenced by a number of physical processes, and dynamics between the ocean and atmosphere, as well as solar energy, drive many of the processes in the ocean surface layer. And ocean currents, waves, and tides are some of the primary drivers, and those that people are most familiar with. The ocean also plays a key role in regulating the climate, and understanding these physical processes is critical to understanding the nutrient dynamics and biological productivity. So as I just reflected on those last slide, those physical processes in the ocean are critical for driving nutrient availability in the ocean. And so as shown in the graphic to the left, a common process through which nutrients are delivered is through upwelling, where winds and the Coriolis effect push surface waters offshore, which results in cold nutrient-rich waters being brought to the surface. This is one of several different mechanisms through which nutrients are delivered to the surface, but upwelling plays a critical role, especially in eastern boundary current systems. And through mixing and upwelling, these nutrient-rich waters are brought to the surface layer and fuel phytoplankton production. And phytoplankton are the foundation to marine food webs. So as we're kind of highlighting these different processes, mostly driven by the physics and then nutrient availability to drive phytoplankton production, it's critical to understanding that, as that is really the base of this food web. And phytoplankton are a primary food source for zooplankton that are then the primary consumers in the food web that then serve as food resources for higher trophic levels. And marine organisms play a critical role in the biological pump and in global carbon cycling. And so as primary producers uptake CO2 and produce organic carbon, that then passes through consumers before a portion is transported to deeper waters. So really, as we're trying to understand these ecosystem level processes, it's really critical to understand the physics and the chemistry that underlie that. And in general, these oceanographic processes are the key drivers for those physical dynamics that we're seeking to better understand as it relates to offshore wind. So really, as we're trying to do research on these topics, it's critical to understand from physics to chemistry to biology. And ocean observing provides a wealth of data on oceanographic processes. And common approaches for ocean observing are depicted in the figure to the left. And this includes moorings, gliders, Argo floats, as well as scientific cruises. And hydrodynamic models are often commonly used to understand large-scale oceanographic processes. And such models consist of atmospheric and ocean circulation models. And both ocean observing and modeling are critical to understanding oceanographic dynamics and understanding baseline conditions. And so really, we want to have a lot of robust data as we go into scenarios of understanding potential effects of offshore wind. And it's really critical to have robust ocean observing data sets to have better informed models. Again, as we seek to understand just the general environment, these are also very useful tools for evaluating potential effects of offshore wind. And with that, I'd like to then pass it over to our three speakers today. So I'll start with a brief introduction, and then I'll pass it over to Eileen. So Eileen Hoffman is a professor and eminent scholar in the Department of Ocean and Earth Sciences and a member of the Center for Coastal Physical Oceanography at Old Dominion University. Her primary research interest is physical biological interactions in marine ecosystems, and her contributions to this area were recognized by her election as Fellow of the AGU. Eileen has held various roles in national and international science organizations. Most recently, she served as chair of the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee for Evaluation of Hydrodynamic Modeling and Implications for Offshore Wind Development with the Nantucket Shoals. Next, we'll hear from Beth Scott. Beth Scott is a professor in marine ecology at the University of Aberdeen. She conducts multidisciplinary research in marine ecology with a focus on using combinations of instrumentation for identification of critical marine habitats and temporal clues on where and when mobile predator and prey species interact. Her recent research portfolio has been directed at the understanding of the effects of marine renewable energy systems on multi-trophic interactions to better understand ecosystem services and climate change knowledge into effective policies. And last, we will hear from Kaus Raghukumar. Kaus is a consultant in marine sciences at Integral Consulting, an international environmental sciences and engineering company headquartered in Seattle, Washington. Prior to joining Integral, he was a research associate at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a postdoc scholar at UC Santa Cruz. Kaus is an oceanographer with a background in physical oceanography, ocean acoustics, and wave propagation physics. He has 16 years of experience in modeling and at-sea measurements of hydrodynamic processes and in underwater acoustics. He is currently involved in modeling efforts to understand the effects of offshore wind development on coastal circulation and to examine the potential environmental effects of marine renewable energy installations. Kaus received a PhD in oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And with that, I'd then like to pass it over to Eileen, who will be sharing her slides first. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can get this to work here. Okay, everybody see that okay? All right, thank you. All right, well, first off, thank you for the introduction. The objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of the National Academy's study that was done to develop their consensus report, Potential Hydrodynamic Impacts of Offshore Wind Development on Nantucket Region Ecology and Evaluation from Wind to Whales. I'll first start with acknowledging the committee that developed the report. The committee members are shown here. The committee members include expertise in hydrodynamics, ocean hydrodynamics, atmospheric dynamics, zooplankton ecology, marine mammal ecology, and also expertise from wind farm installations in the European waters, and also observational and modeling activities. So let me start with a little bit of background on the Nantucket Shoals region, which is shown here on this slide. The Nantucket Shoals region is located to the southwest of Cape Cod on the U.S. East Coast. Also shown on this slide is the outline of the proposed wind energy lease areas that are planned for installation in this part of the U.S. continental shelf. The colors represent the 9 different wind energy projects that are either proposed or are under development for this region. All right, so the committee was given a statement of task. The full statement of task is quite long, but it's given in the committee report, so I'll ask you to maybe look at it there. But an abbreviated version of the statement of task is shown on this slide. All right, so the first task was to undertake a synthesis or assess the state of the science about the effects of offshore wind turbine structures. In other words, what do we know? Then based on the second task was based on this literature review and public information gathering sessions, and it was to give an assessment of the ability to estimate the effects of offshore wind energy structures on hydrodynamics and ecology. In other words, can the effects be observed? The committee was then asked to evaluate the models that are being applied to offshore wind energy areas, and the committee was asked again to determine whether or not the effects can in fact be modeled and simulated. And finally, the committee was asked to suggest approaches for assessing the hydrodynamic impacts of offshore wind turbine generators. Okay, so I'll briefly describe the hydrodynamic and biological ecological characteristics of the Nantucket Shoals region. The summary schematic in the left panel here shows that the hydrodynamics of the Nantucket Shoals region are complex. There are interactions of processes that extend all the way from the shelf break to seasonal stratification over the shelf to the inshore tidally mixed area. All right, so it's a complicated area. And a clear result from the synthesis that the committee did is that major oceanographic changes have occurred in this region since about 2000, and that the system is continuously evolving, and that's an important point here. All right, so as shown at the bottom of the schematic, changes in the oceanography can produce changes in the ecosystem. All right, so the focus for the Nantucket Shoals study was, for the biology and the ecology, was the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, which is shown on the slide here, and its interactions with its copepod prey, specifically Calanus finmarchicus, and the life cycle of Calanus finmarchicus is showing in the lower right-hand side of the slide here. All right, and the reason for this is that Nantucket Shoals region is an important foraging area for right whales during winter to spring when they migrate to this area to forage. The other thing is that the copepods that they tend to forage on are likely advected into the region rather than being locally produced, which places emphasis on understanding any changes to the hydrodynamics. So how was the assessment done? Well, the committee framed its assessment around the 3 scales that are shown on this slide that represent effects at the wind turbine scale, the wind farm scale, and the regional scale. And the spatial range included in each of the scales is shown at the bottom of each of the figures here. All right, so what type of effects were considered for the hydrodynamics? Well, this is illustrated using the wind turbine scale shown here in the left panel. The primary atmospheric effect is removal of wind energy, which creates an atmospheric weight downstream of a turbine with reduced energy. This affects the surface ocean processes. In the ocean, the turbine structure causes an ocean wake, meaning that the water becomes more turbulent downstream of the turbine. Both of these effects carry over to the wind farm scale, but we know that from our report that significant uncertainties exist in understanding these effects, and much of what is known is based on a few studies that was done in the North Sea. The schematic on the right provides a summary of potential ecological effects. The wind farms can potentially affect all trophic levels, and we just heard from Katie the importance of those. All right, but the important interaction here is that between the zooplankton prey and the North Atlantic right whale. And as I mentioned before, the concern is the potential of the wind turbines and the wind farms to disrupt the abundance and aggregation of zooplankton, which can in turn disrupt right whale foraging patterns. So what is the state of being able to estimate perturbations from the wind turbines and the wind structures on the hydrodynamic regime? Well, at the turbine scale, there are a few observations for verification of wake behavior. The potential effects at the wind farm scale that are shown on this slide are based on limited modeling studies. They are not grounded in observations. And the hydrodynamic effects at a regional scale are difficult to quantify because of natural variability. So this table summarizes the results of model capability that's needed to assess the effects at the different scales. If we look at this, idealized models can be applied across all these scales to look at key processes. The large eddy simulations, non-hydrostatic models, and the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations models can support predictions, but they do it at different scales. So a conclusion from this assessment is that a range of models that resolve the appropriate scales are needed to address the questions about the effects of wind turbines and wind farms on the hydrodynamics. So what about impacts on right whales? A summary of the ability to assess these impacts is on this slide here. So we've already heard that the hydrodynamic impacts on the zooplankton are currently difficult to isolate. There is a gap in our understanding of foraging by North Atlantic right whales in the Nantucket Shoals region, right? And that makes it difficult to identify an impact. The studies that are concentrated at a wind farm scale do not adequately capture the broad scale use of the Nantucket Shoals region by the right whales. And that's important because the right whale foraging decisions depend on the availability of prey at sources and resources in distant habitats. As a result, the effects on the right whale will be difficult to detect or predict. Right now, because of the limited time, I'm not showing you the details for the 4 primary recommendations from the report. I encourage you to read the report and look at these recommendations. But what I will do is provide a short summary of the conclusions of the study, which is shown on this slide. The first conclusion is that the significant natural and anthropogenic variability in the Nantucket's region shoals oceanography and ecology suggests that perturbations in the hydrodynamics due to wind farm development are likely to be difficult to detect and isolate. Effects on the zooplankton are also likely to be difficult to distinguish. Right? The second conclusion is that significant uncertainties exist in assessing the hydrodynamic impacts that are associated with the wind and ocean wake effects at the local, farm, and regional scale, the abundance and aggregation of zooplankton, including the right whale prey, and current and future foraging patterns of North Atlantic right whales. So the recommendations strongly support the need for integrated hydrodynamic and ecological observational and modeling studies before, during, and all phases of wind energy development. That is, it goes from surveying, construction, operation, and decommissioning. All right, so where are we going with this? Well, as an update, There was a BOEM-sponsored workshop convened 2 weeks ago to design a field monitoring program that would respond to the observational and modeling recommendations from this National Academy Consensus Study report. The report from that workshop will be available in about 6 weeks. All right, so I'll stop there, ask if there are any questions, or try to answer your questions later. And thank you for your attention. And if you want to learn more about the study or the process, this very long link at the bottom of the slide will take you to the report. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. I think in the interest of time, we'll pass it along to Beth. And folks, if you do have questions, you're welcome to leave those in the chat. So thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.
Okay, I shall check that I am. Is the screen working?
Not quite yet for me.
Okay, just a second. Is that working?
Yes, the slide deck is showing it's not in the presenter mode. So, but yeah, something is showing.
Okay. 1 second. Sorry about that. Just a second. I'm going to stop sharing and try one more time. I have 3 screens here, which is why I have this issue. There we go. There, that should work this
Yep,
time.
that looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hi there. Yes, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Beth Scott, and I'm going to talk to you about a project called Pelagio, which stands for Physics to Ecosystem Level Assessments of Impacts of Offshore Wind Farms. And you'll see on the screen here lots and lots of the groups, the academic groups, and the project partners. Just a second. Is this? Now my screen is not working right. Just a second. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully now you see a second screen with then what I thought the better way of showing was to show everybody that's involved, to just show you this kind of incredible interdisciplinary project we have going, which has oceanographers, fishery scientists, seabird experts, marine modelers, ecosystem modelers. And then what I'll concentrate on here, so this is a program that's active now, and EcoWind, the big program, the National Science Council program, is called Ecosystem Effects on Wind Farms. And it's got 3 big areas of study. So the one area that we had set out that we needed to study was looking at these interactions between all of the different trophic levels. The second one was to use novel oceanographic instrumentation to collect data. And the third one is we have to take all this information and inform policy. So what we've done in Pelagio is we have these 3 big work packages. So we're one of 4 projects in this big EcoWind program. So we're a £2.5 million project within a £10 million program. And what we have then in our work package 1, very much what you've just seen with Eileen, is that we have our physical effects looking at local, regional, and shelf-wide scale so that we can also integrate climate change effects. Then what we have in our work package 2 is that interaction of predator to prey, where here we're looking at mainly fish up to availability to seabirds. And then thirdly, we're looking at the whole ecosystem. So we're taking all of the information we're learning and we're putting it through ecosystem models so that we can assess trade-offs and try to go right up to policy. And so very much as Eileen shows, we've got 3 different types of models. So we are modeling and collecting in the field, and I'll show you in a second, all of this data. So at this fine scale, we're looking at the drag underneath, what's happening to the structure and how the mixing is changing. At the regional scale, what we're looking at is the wind wake effect that Eileen just talked about, the extracting of the energy. And then what we're doing there is we're combining 3D oceanographic models here called FVCOM, plus a biological ones called URSAM. And then on the shelf-wide ones, we'll use those same models, but we'll use them at whole shelf-side scales, and we'll then bring in our climate estimates for business as usual. So a little more detail then about some of the modeling we've already done. So in this modeling work, we're sitting here in the east coast of Scotland, and we're looking at a real wind farm called the Seagreen Wind Farm. And we're looking at how it is affecting the level of stratification. And in this case, we're using potential energy anomaly, or PEA, the amount of energy it takes to mix up the water column to show the difference. So on the left-hand side, you see the wind farm sitting in situ, and then on the right-hand side, you see the difference, a seasonal difference in the amount of stratification. And with the blue color is saying it's really actually mixing the water quite a bit. And so then what I wanted to say is we also then, of course, are looking above the water at the wind wake effect. And what you're seeing in this slightly complex slide, with the animation going, that is showing you the amount of the decrease in wind wake behind the three. These are real ones going in. The top and bottom one are already in. The middle one is still going in. And what you'll see with that is these wind farms, of course, are going to interact with each other because this wind wake takes up to 60 kilometers. And then moving to the left of the screen there, we're looking at the net primary production over time. And what it's showing us in the pink areas, that's when the spring bloom happens. And it's showing us it's quite complex, that during the beginning of the spring bloom, there's actually a decrease in the amount of plankton being predicted. But afterwards, later in the bloom, when there's less food around, it's showing an increase. So that might have a biological effect on fish feeding. And then I'm showing, again, the figure I showed before about the amount of change in the wind wake in terms of the spatial amounts of chlorophyll A. So this is really showing in red the increases in chlorophyll A, and blue the decreases. And what it's telling us is there's these dipole effects that are happening when you extract wind energy out, and they go a long way away from the wind farms. So what we're doing to try and prove all this modeling is correct is we have a huge field campaign. So we really pushed hard to get as much instrumentation into the water as possible. So what you're looking at here, again, in this spot on the east coast of Scotland, the sea green, and then what we're looking at is most of our instrumentation is in the downwind, where it's supposed to be the downwind side of the wind farm, but you know, whether our weather is playing ball or not. So we've got our gliders going back and forth in this green and purple area going between two waypoints. And then we've got these red spots, or CTD casts. And what we have in this area is similar to what Eileen said, but on a smaller scale, a very mosaic area with highly mixed, highly stratified freshwater influence. So when we see differences in this area, we think we can take them to many other areas. And then what we also have is moorings, and I'll talk more about those in more, these upward facing moorings to look at fish and physics. But just to concentrate a bit on the gliders, what we've seen so far in last year's data, on this top panel, what you're looking at is over 3 months' time, you're looking at the temperature from the surface to the bottom and seeing that it warms up, and then we have some cooling periods of storminess coming in. And then on the second panel, you're seeing our spring neap cycles. We have 7 of those, so n equals 7, and that we can start to look at some patterns, because in the third panel, what you're looking at is the actual wind speeds. And what was interesting is the wind farm was in its first year of operation, so it was on and off a bit. So we have periods where we can look at wind speeds with the wind farm operating and with it not operating. And we're very excited to be seeing some results coming through there. Then what we've done is we've then done surveys, as suggested by Eileen. We've done surveys where we've gone around in circles, but we've also then put our moorings down where we're trying to look at fish and seabirds. And here's an example on this slide then of our survey where we're going around, and then the top one is just looking at the 3 species of auk species we're seeing as we go around in the circles. And then the bottom one is looking at the fish we're seeing, which we think are mostly sand eels and some herring. And we're looking where we do see a fish and birds at the same time. So what we then also did with these moorings, as I said, we put them out, and we've put them 500 meters away and then 50 meters away from the turbines. And this funny little image then on the left here is us showing that's the base of the turbine, and where we've put the mooring is so that it's in the major ellipse of the tidal axis. And so we can look at the overtime predictability of these fish and what they're doing. And we're just sorting through that at the moment. And there is a lot of interesting differences between the turbine 550 meter placements. We've also then worked with the RSPB, which is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. They've had these big tagging programs. We've got these beautiful brand new GPS tags that are really high resolution and do what they call geofencing, so that you put an area on the map, and when the bird is in that area, like the wind farm, it can actually take many more times of data per second. So lots of that is coming in. And why we're doing that is essentially what we're trying to do is we know that probably fish are moved around by physics. and we know that seabirds want to eat a fish. And so what we're trying to do is jump the gap there and trying to find ways to predict fish feeding by the predictability of the physics and find these validated relationships so that we can relate everything back to the oceanography. And why that's super important is this final bit I'm going to talk about is the Bayesian models we're using to try to bring these all together. So this funny looking image over in the right-hand side of the figure, that is all of the things like a food web, all the things that we've put into the Bayesian model to run it. And all the things in blue are all the physical things that you could think of, like changes in mixing. And then we've got the green is then zooplankton and plankton. And then we've got seabirds and then up to, fish and then up to seabirds and mammals. And what happens in these models is there's no population dynamics. These are machine learning. They are pattern-driven models. And so what I'm showing on the graph here is an example of cod, one of the fish species we've put in. And in red, what you're seeing along the 33 years we've run the model. Red is the real data in terms of recruitment of cod, and blue is the predicted from the model. So there are no population dynamics in this model. What is being predicted, how that blue line is being predicted, is those three indicators: the mixed layer depth, the maximum chlorophyll, the plankton at the mixed layer depth, and the landings of demersal fish. Just those three things are getting us this quite good fit of a model, such that we can look at then play scenarios and change the physics and watch what happens. So this is my last data slide. And what I'm showing here then is one of the scenarios we've run where we've run climate change effects and offshore wind effects, i.e. the changes in temperature, increases in temperature and stratification we know is going to happen with some of the offshore wind effects. And then what we've done, where you saw on that slide about we had good plankton and bad plankton, or more or less plankton. So we did some scenarios where green is 10% more plankton, bad is 10% less plankton. We run that over 25 years. And we've looked at the difference between our baseline, our blue line back there, and what these predictions are. And then we've just made an average of what looks like the change in breeding success in this case for 4 different species of seabirds. And what you see is what you might expect is that in the good plankton years, the green years, the seabirds have better breeding success, 3 species, and that 3 species have worse breeding success when we have poor plankton. But our razorbills actually are doing something very strange and showing us that they're not very happy no matter what happens as we go into some climate change effects. So to summarize what we've done in this project is we've got our 3 large work packages where we first look at the physics. So we have that targeted work with all these novel combination of gliders and surveys and upward-facing platforms, and we're validating the biophysical models, and we're quite excited about some of the results coming through. And then with our predator to prey work package, we're really looking for these links of the physical variables between the fish availability, i.e. the predictability of fish to seabirds, foraging seabirds, and therefore we can have predict what's going to happen when offshore wind farms change the system. And then finally, with our ecosystem models, we've identified these physical and biological indicators that can be changed by offshore winds and climate change. So we can quantify, and we do it to cumulative effects. And these main effects on the right-hand side, these are things coming out of our models and our real data, is saying it is definitely bottom-up effects that are the biggest ones. Climate change is massive compared to offshore wind. Planktivorous fish are our most important species. And I haven't shown it here, but the effects of changing fishing are showing to be some of our biggest effects coming through. So that is me, and that is the project Pelagio.
Thank you so much, Beth. And next we're going to hear from Kaus. So thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about some similar.
You're not in present, or yeah, it's showing in presenter mode, or like the slides with notes. So
I see. So I guess I need to swap it.
Yeah, I think if you do, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Swap. How's that?
Yep, that looks great.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a project that we completed about a couple of years ago. We started working on this back in 2020, and it's about projected cross-shore changes in upwelling induced by a hypothetical offshore wind farm along the California coast. We are a fairly large team that worked on this. My colleagues from NREL include Tim Nelson and Grace Chang, Mike Jacobs from NOAA Fisheries, Jerome Fischer from UC Santa Cruz, Chris Chartrand, Lawrence, and Jesse from Sandia National Labs. All right, so before we launch into the potential effects of offshore wind or upwelling, I figured it'll be good to kind of just reorient ourselves on what upwelling exactly is. So there are for this particular problem or question we're asking, we are primarily concerned with two forms of upwelling. One is called coastal upwelling, the other is called current-driven upwelling. In coastal upwelling, when you have sustained alongshore winds, say along the west coast, along eastern boundary current, which is what the U.S. west coast is, it forms the eastern boundary of the Pacific Ocean. So when you have sustained alongshore winds, basically what happens is, because of the Earth's rotation, surface waters are advected offshore. And because of this deficit, effectively a deficit, it's replaced by cool, deep, nutrient-rich waters from deeper water. This kind of conveyor belt, offshore transport, and then the offshore transport of surface waters, and the replacement by cool, deep, nutrient-rich waters is coastal upwelling, and it kind of sustains this highly rich ecosystem we have on the west coast of the United States. And the second form of upwelling is when you have a gradient in wind stress or a portion of the wind field that blows over the surface ocean. That gradient in wind forcing, it creates a divergence along the surface, which also leads to replacement of that water by cool, deep, nutrient-rich waters. Coastal upwelling is a much more energetic process in terms of nutrient delivery to the surface waters, but it does occur over a much narrower zone. Curl-driven upwelling is somewhat slower compared to coastal upwelling, but it occurs over a much larger zone. So the question we posed to the California Energy Commission back in 2020 was if there's any reduction in the lee of a wind farm due to wind energy extraction by a farm of wind turbine generators. Is there the potential for that reduction in wind speeds to affect wind-driven upwelling? We then undertook a modeling study, as I'll show here, to answer this question, where we used a wind model, an atmospheric model, which was capable of modeling the reduction in wind speeds in the lee of each wind turbine or a wind farm, and we used both the kind of an unperturbed model, so baseline model, no turbines, and then a wind turbine model where turbines have been introduced into the same atmospheric model. We kind of separately forced an ocean model with these two sets of wind forcings, and then we looked at the effect with and without turbines on upwelling in terms of operational upwelling metrics. So here I show vertical velocities associated with the wind fields, and we basically tells us what the vertical velocity is, whether the velocity in the surface waters are going up into or upwelling or towards the surface, or going down, which would be downwelling. We kind of parse these vertical velocities out into two different components. So the coastal so the vertical velocity associated with coastal upwelling, shown in the upper row there, and the vertical velocity associated with curl-driven upwelling, that's the bottom row, and the right-hand column shows the differences once turbines are introduced. So first, in terms of baseline vertical velocities, both coastal and curl-driven upwelling are primarily in this coastal zone. And we see all the usual suspects start to stand out in terms of upwelling hotspots. Examples are Point Conception, which is a major biogeographic boundary between Central and Southern California, Point Arena, further up north in Northern California, and then Cape Mendocino. And then we see very little change in the coastal upwelling portion of the vertical velocities. But if you start to look now in the lower right panel, which is the curl-driven portion of the vertical velocities, we see this dipole effect, which Sarah also mentioned in the previous talk. And this dipole basically tells us that there's a reduction of curl-driven upwelling on the inshore side of the wind farm, and an increase in curl-driven upwelling on the offshore side of the wind farm. So again, in this particular case, in our study here, I should clarify that we're only looking at the physical circulation. So this is just the physical vertical velocity. We don't know. We haven't run an ecosystem model, so we can't tell anything about what the implications of this dipole are on nutrient delivery to the photic zone. But we can start to infer what the effects are on upwelling are in terms of two different indices, operational indices, which are published by NOAA very regularly. The first is a coastal upwelling transport index, QD, which is a measure of the physical volume transport, so how much water is being upwelled. And the second is BEAUTY, a biologically effective upwelling transport index, which is an estimate of nitrate flux, or in other words, it's a surrogate for nutrient transport to the photic zone. We don't estimate nitrate flux or nutrient transport from an ecosystem model, but we infer it from a relationship between temperature and nitrate, which exists, which is a very tight relationship below the mixed layer. So shown here, we're only showing QD here. There's a baseline QD, so again, the upwelling hotspots in terms of volume transport also show up in this thin band along the west coast. Hotspots include, again, Point Arena, Cape Mendocino, and Point Conception. There's also this upwelling zone, intense upwelling zone along the Big Sur coast. And in terms of changes now, again, we see this reduction in upwelling in terms of the QD index on the inshore side of the wind farm in Morro Bay in the Central California area, and an increase further offshore. If you look at the other area of interest, which is Humboldt, it's another official wind energy area around 41 degrees north. We see a similar pattern of reduction on the inshore side of the wind farm, increase in upwelling on the offshore side of the wind farm. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer any further questions in the discussion. But our main findings here is that we saw very little change in upwelling in the coastal upwelling portion in that 10-kilometer intense coastal upwelling zone through a wind farm. So I'm showing three panels. The first is Humboldt, second is Morro Bay, and very little change in the narrow coastal upwelling zone. A modest reduction in this 10-kilometer to 50-kilometer zone that goes through the wind energy areas. And then depending on the geometry, the Humboldt case has an increase in upwelling further offshore, and there's no real change or a small reduction, in fact, when you go further offshore in the Morro Bay area. These changes are primarily present only in and around the wind energy areas, so there's no real change north or south of either wind energy area, which is what these black arrows in the right panel shows. Future work includes, all of this work was only the physical oceanographic model, so just the physics. The next step is we're currently working on integrating an ecosystem model to see what the potential effects of this upwelling are, and the physical upwelling changes are on the ecosystem. And there's maybe got two papers out of this. Feel free to scan that QR code and it'll launch you into, it'll take you a couple links, hopefully. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Klaus. So as a reminder, we're going to start a bit of a moderated Q&A, and then we'll open the floor for some audience questions. So just as a reminder to folks, we've had a couple of questions come through already, but if you do have questions for any of the panelists, please put those in the chat, and we will hopefully get to some of those at the end. So to kick us off, I think each of you highlighted research from 3 different areas. And so, like, just want to acknowledge that research is occurring in different regions where there are different oceanographic regimes. And so, how can we learn from research that's occurring in other regions where those oceanographic conditions might differ, especially when findings for one region are not necessarily transferable to another region? And I think each of you can probably provide insights on your respective area, but yeah, just would like to open the floor for a conversation on how do we acknowledge differences in oceanographic conditions, but still take lessons learned from areas to inform how we understand potential change? So maybe Eileen, will start with you and then just follow with Beth and Kaus.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's a good question, and it's with the National Academies Committee, it's something that we talked about quite a bit because a lot of the information we were looking at was not from the Nantucket Shoals area. In fact, very little of it was. So, but I think as we've seen in the other presentations, there are some common processes, like wind extraction, energy extraction downstream of a turbine, ocean wakes. They are going to happen. Those kinds of things are going to happen. The details may, in fact, vary because stratification differs in the different areas or things like that. But I think we can learn what to look for by looking across systems, and comparative studies are very powerful. All right, so you can learn a lot about your system by looking at other systems. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through this, and these wind farm installations are being put in different parts of the world and different parts of the ocean. I think we can all learn from those.
Yeah, I would say excellent answer. And my joke is, as an ecologist, that I say the physics is easy. And what I mean by that, not that the science is easy, but that the physics will stay the same. Exactly that. Once we understand momentum sinks and the amount of drag, and we look at it in different systems, and we understand the amount of energy extraction from wind, exactly that. It's really what will be different is how stratified the regimes are, whether they're freshwater influenced or not, whether they're strongly stratified, as to where the effects are. And then, of course, then local species. Once you get to the biology, then that becomes complicated, because what are the local species of plankton and zooplankton that are going to be affected? And they may be quite different in different regions. But the physics part, once everybody's compared and contrasted, I think we can pass that around the world and everybody can use a lot of the same parameterization.
Yeah, my answer as a physical oceanographer is that the physics is that like the physics is what drives processes that lead to animal attraction and so on. And these processes are different in different regions of the world. So, for example, on the West Coast, it's an upwelling dominated zone. So any study, particularly in modeling or measurement campaign, would have to make sure that you're able to either model the distribution of upwelling hotspots, intensity of upwelling correctly. Measurement campaigns would need to make targeted measurements of say upwelling plumes, for example. But in the Nantucket Shoals region, for example, the primary driver for the ecosystem or the right whale, which is the question that we studied in the committee, were dense aggregations of zooplanktons. And the processes that lead to those aggregations on the Nantucket Shoals is different from upwelling on the West Coast. So any physical oceanographic measurement or modeling campaign would need to make sure that you're able to model those fine-scale processes that lead to those aggregations. So yeah, it definitely varies based on region, and it really comes down to what physical processes are driving ecosystem functions and services in any region of the world, and any modeling or measurement campaign would need to take that into account.
Yeah. Oh, Eileen, did you have anything? It sounded like you might be coming on.
No, I was just thinking, what Beth and Kyle said, it's important once you get past the physics to have a good characterization of the food web in an area, and even with differences in them, we can do some comparisons. And I think that for me, from my perspective, trying to do ecosystem models, that's not always something that's available, and I would think of that as being a very baseline type of thing to need for each of these areas.
Can I say then on that point exactly, which is why we've gone to the machine learning ecosystem model approach, is that you're not going to have intense data in all kinds of places and all the functional responses. And what we're finding then is this approach is actually where we do have a lot of data. It's working really well. And therefore, I think we can take that information to other areas that don't have as much data and know that actually just a few years of data might really show us some of the complex biological interactions that would take years and years and years of sampling to get to. So we do think it's one way of speeding things up is to use these machine learning approaches.
Thank you. I think that also lends nicely to the next question, which I think we're already starting to discuss, which is really focused more on how to bring ecology into these studies. I think some of you have more focus on the ecosystem element, others more on the physics. And so when we do rely on those physics-based models, how can you ensure that those ecological processes are well captured or represented? And maybe to add on to that too, like if you had an ideal world, like where you could think about data, like what types of data would be most valuable to better informing those models? And I'll let, maybe Beth, do you want to, I feel like you might, yeah.
I'll jump in on that first. Yeah. My big point would be concurrent, that when you are measuring things, if you measure things concurrently, the physics and the fish and the zooplankton concurrently, you will so quickly learn versus trying to do one thing at a time. And I think that's been the Achilles heels of so much, is that so much of our ocean research is specialists going out measuring fish or birds or zooplankton and not doing it together. And we look at the Antarctic, where it's so expensive, everybody goes down together. They know so much more about how the system, I think, works down there than we do with some of our systems. So yeah, concurrent measurements so using instruments that can work across multiple trophic levels is the one way, again, to speed things up.
Helene or Kaus, either of you have anything to respond to on that?
I just say that that's an excellent point, is to have concurrent measurements and to characterize the entire food web as a food web, rather than I'm going to measure the phytoplankton and then later on I'm going to measure the fish. It's, to measure the whole system, or at least provide enough information to characterize the whole system. Because as Beth said, we're not going to have detailed data on all aspects of it, but at least know what the pieces are.
Yeah, I totally agree with both Beth and Eileen. And just want to add that, like ultimately we're really concerned about the ecosystem effects, and we just need to recognize that if all there is going to be a change in circulation, for example, with no real ecosystem effects, it's not as attractive a topic as any ecosystem effects. So we need to start with the asking what kind of ecosystem effects do we foresee, and then work our way towards understanding the food web and the physics that drives the food web, and basically approach the question from starting with the ecosystem effects.
Yeah, I think that's great. And maybe I'll have one just quick question, and then we can move on to the Q&A with the audience, because I want to have some time for that. But recognizing that we're in a changing climate, how is climate change accounted for in this type of research, and understanding what the potential effects of offshore wind are in relation to climate change? How does one best move forward with research on those topics to distinguish effects?
So I've mentioned here that was, again, a topic that the committee struggled with, or had a lot of discussions with, is perhaps the better way to say it, is how to distinguish natural variability, long-term climate change, and short-term perturbations from something like a wind farm installation. And what we came down to was that there is so much uncertainty around each one of those that trying to separate the effects with the information we have right now is going to be extremely difficult to do. But that's not to say you can design monitoring programs that could provide information that might allow those effects which occur at different scales to be separated. And that's was the focus of part of the focus of the workshop that was convened 2 weeks ago to develop a monitoring and observational program around the recommendations from the National Academy's report. So I'm not sure we're there yet. I'm not sure we know how to do it, but we're at least starting to try to figure it out. And I think the program that Beth and company are doing, it is a good example of of a way to start looking at how some of these interactions occur and perhaps the scales over which they occur.
Yeah, what we've tried to do is, well, with all of our real data, really look at the whole season, a season that stratifies, and really look at the level of natural variability that's going on there. Although last year we got given a 5-degree heat wave, that really added to the natural variability. But then what we're doing is we're going to run several years of our big models of the whole North Sea, and they're going to be years with very different climate, so very different NAO signals and stuff, so really cold years, warm years, and start to pull apart what does it look like when you just have climate change, and then with these variables that we parameterize coming through in terms of the momentum sink and the wind extraction, putting those through and just looking at the difference and seeing if we can pull apart the difference and quantify the difference in the physical variables, and then up to plankton predictions. But I don't think we'll go much farther than that, but at least then we'll start to be able to quantify if we can see those differences with climate change.
Yeah, my contribution here would be just to suggest that any results for studies that look at the effects of offshore wind should not only be presented both in terms of like the changes relative to natural variability, but also in terms of changes relative to a do nothing kind of scenario for greenhouse gas emissions, because there are really strong climate signals and climate changes that are occurring because of this do nothing scenario, and any potential changes due to offshore winds do need to consider what's that change relative to the do nothing scenario.
Yeah, we have done that with tidal energy some years ago. We looked at taking as much as we could out of Scotland, which was only 6 gigawatts, but and then looked at 2050, business as usual. And the takeaway message there was climate change, even by 2050, was 10 times more of a physical effect than anything and that's extreme amounts of tidal energy out of our waters, and it was causing some changes for certain. You could see the tidal the amphidrotic points were changing, and we were getting some like 2-centimeter changes in Belgium, even though we were extracting it out of Scotland. So there were definitely changes, but climate change was 10 times worse by 2050, and by 2050 it hasn't really bifurcated into the worst extremes yet.
Thank you. I realize we're close to time, but I do want to pull out one audience question, and I think this perhaps can be answered pretty quickly by the panelists. And that's as to whether any of the research that you've been involved in has influenced the outcome for siting or construction design decisions for wind energy development. And so, yeah, do you feel like your research is being used for that siting element at all?
Sure, I'll go. Yeah, we have received a lot of interest in this work from several offshore wind developers on the West Coast, and then we are currently in conversations in doing more focused studies around specific lease areas on the West Coast, and we're hopeful that those focused studies will lead to kind of I guess some kind of optimization kind of framework in in siting and layout of the wind farms.
And I could say that both the government and the industries have been extremely interested in what we're doing. We tried to get this type of funding from our government 10 years ago, so we're a bit frustrated that we could have done this modeling 10 years ago and we could be ahead of the curve right now, but we still have multiple rounds coming through the system where, and like I say, the industry is as interested as anyone to do this well and to do it right in terms of ecological sustainability. So yeah, people are looking at this and they are going to take this up. Our research program, all the 4 programs that are projects that are running within this program, we've actually got a signed over that we will put this information out as fast as we possibly can to our policymakers.
Yeah, I think the work that we've done has not been so much in informing and citing wind farms as in mitigation, perhaps, of impact of wind farms, which is also as important, I think. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you so much. And I apologize that we didn't get to more of the audience questions, but I'd like to see if panelists are open to us sending along those questions and responding to them. If you have availability just via email, we can have more of that follow-up for some of the questions that were posed. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks again to all of our speakers today. Really appreciate your time. I think this is really interesting research and really gets at better understanding what the potential effects of offshore wind are on oceanographic processes. And so thank you again for your time. And yeah, as a reminder to folks, the webinar will be posted online, and I will just share really quick, if you do have any questions or anything, you can reach me at my contact information that's listed here, and also materials will be available on that TETHIS website. So yeah, thanks again for everyone's participation and have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.